why did I do this? Because it felt right. Like it felt like the best metaphor for me in a way. Like it was all of these creative, analytical, socially conscious, kind of all these things coming together that no one else had done before and was like something truly different than anything else in the market. And it just felt right. And at no point during the process was I like, yeah, do you want to abandon this right now? Like, do you want to like cut this off? And it just, there was never really a point where that had happened. So I just kept going with it. And now I'm here.
Welcome to Small Acts of Rebellion, a podcast where the unspoken narratives at the intersection of our personal and professional lives come to light. I'm your host, Heather Pridemore, your guide on this journey of discovery and defiance. Join me as we uncover the rebellious spirit that shapes our careers and lives. It's time to own your story. Are you ready? Today's guest is Liz Nartker, a multi-talented entrepreneur, creative thinker, and founder of the shoe brand Nix and Ness. From her early days navigating the expectations of a gifted child in suburban Chicago to her dynamic career that spans law, education, writing, and now footwear design, Liz has embraced reinvention at every turn. With a fascinating journey that includes law school at the University of Chicago, teaching first-year law students, and becoming an expert on the 2008 mortgage meltdown, Liz has always found ways to blend creativity with purpose. Now based in Denver, she's channeling her experiences and passions into a brand that reflects her unique vision for life and style. Welcome to the show, Liz.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I have to tell you, Liz, it's your shoes that first drew me to you. You had on the ankle booties that have the phrases on them where you can change what the shoe says. And many of your shoes contain quotes from famous authors and the like. And so that really just resonates with me. I am a person who collects quotes. I, love little sayings, and I also love shoes. So my first impression of you was your booties.
I think that's fair. And in some ways, that's part of why I created the shoes that I did, right? Because I've always loved looking at other people's shoes, and I love wearing fun shoes. And the boot that I created where you could change your own quote each day, I kind of love that idea because it did reflect what you wanted out of that day or who you felt like you were channeling or something like that. So
now I think it's interesting to your career because, when you say lawyer, and I'm going to be really general here because I actually know some really interesting lawyers, but when you say lawyer, you don't think of someone who would have the background, for example, that you have in your office with lots of art and design and all of these things. And you definitely wouldn't think probably of someone who would eventually make shoes. So, I just think it's interesting that you've had this sort of what I would consider almost like previous career that's a little bit maybe from a value standpoint in opposition of what you do today. And again, these are all generalizations, but I want to talk about your career first, Liz, because I think that there's so much interesting stuff there. And as I've alluded already, it's multiple industries. You've worked in entertainment, law, entrepreneurship, and I'm sure that each role has offered you unique challenges as well as opportunities. And so I was just hoping that you might walk us through that evolution. Share how those transitions shaped your approach to navigating change and embracing new directions.
I have worked in a lot of industries and had a lot of different roles. And in some ways, all of them have been exactly who I am, and none of them have been exactly who I am, right? They've all encompassed a part of me. And part of the name Nix and Ness actually stands for a phoenix. And I kind of feel like my career evolution or my whole life evolution has been kind of this continual, all the pieces of me have been there every single time, but I've kind of reorganized myself or rebuilt myself in the same way that maybe a phoenix has. You think of that rebuilding. When you first asked me to think about my career, I actually kind of went all the way back into high school. Like, a lot of times, I mean, you know, you've asked a kid, like, what do you want to be when you grow up, right? So, like, our careers sometimes start before we're actually working. They're a mindset. And as a younger kid, I was like very focused on being perfect, very focused on perfect in academia. And I had always been told that I was smart. And so, side note, I never compliment my children on being smart. I always tell them how hard they worked or, how creative they were, because being smart is not something they can do anything about. It's not an accomplishment. It's like having brown hair, right? Like in some ways. So I had so much of my identity in this idea that I had to be smart. And sophomore year of high school, like that ended in kind of like a breakdown. So I went to a therapist who was like, listen, like there's this whole other side of you that you are not exploring or even allowing to exist because you're so focused on kind of these traditional ideas of what it means to be smart and successful. So that started two things for me, which was I kind of had this idea in my head that it was like an either or. I was either creative or I was kind of like analytical, traditional academic. And there wasn't a blending in there. And then two, because I have like kind of an extreme personality, I just jumped on the creative bandwagon and was like, yes, this is me now. So I like took fashion class and I learned how to sew and I took, did theater and I like loved it. And I really threw myself into that, which led to me going to college for theater. And there I did performances. I also did a ton of costume design. I like really explored all of it. And so thinking about careers, like when I went to college for theater, the idea was, well, I want to go to LA and be in the entertainment industry. Like I had this idea that that was what I wanted to do after college. And by senior year of college, I kind of had an inkling that like maybe that wasn't the best place for me, or maybe that wasn't what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. But I also felt like if I didn't go out there and actually check it out myself, that I was going to regret that later on. So I moved to LA and did a lot of different stuff. I kind of bounced around. I worked for a manager. I worked for an entertainment law firm. I worked on a couple like independent movies, doing some of it acting, some of it costume. Like I really jumped around a lot, talked to a lot of people. And it didn't take too long before I realized that like I was right. It wasn't for me. And part of that was I realized that like one of the jobs I had enjoyed the most was working for the entertainment law firm. And my dad's a lawyer. So like he had always been like, you're so much like me, you should be a lawyer. Like he had always kind of pushed that a little bit. So I one day was like, okay, well, how does this lawyer thing work? How do you get to law school? I took an LSAT exam and I scored like a 162 randomly, which if you have any lawyers in the audience, they'll probably not believe me. But so I decided, okay, that's good enough. Like I didn't have money for like a course on LSATs or something. So I just like bought like 2 books of old exams, and every day for a month and a half, I would take an exam and eventually felt pretty comfortable and, took the LSAT and I scored like a 174. It's out of 180. And that was like a sign to me that like law school was the right place for me. Like this was what I should be doing if I can do this well at the test, which, now after having practiced and being around a bunch of lawyers, like it's laughable because we all know that standardized testing has like nothing to do with your actual job performance or how good you're actually going to be at something. But I guess I kind of like needed a sign in that moment. So I ended up going to University of Chicago, which is very academic focused. And so I flipped almost 180 again, right? Like went from, no, I'm this creative person to like, no, I'm this analytical, academic, focused person. And And there was a part of me that like really loves that. Like I love reading and learning and, thinking critically and like logically. But I had kind of once again like swung to an extreme, if you will. But I felt like once I kind of got into it, that I had to follow through. I had to see it through. So after practicing for a while and being kind of pigeonholed into after 2008, like the economy collapsed for like a lot of people, including a lot of professionals, So a lot of us were stuck doing a lot of the people who had graduated around the time I did got stuck doing like work related to the mortgage meltdown because there was so much litigation. And it was really big clients. Like it was Bank of America and Wells Fargo and Countrywide and New York Stock Exchange. I mean, it was all, Goldman Sachs. It was like all these giant clients at these giant law firms in an obscene amount of litigation that took, I'm sure there's still litigation going on right now, like related to it. And it was, I want to say this delicately, but I'm not going to. It sucked. It was terrible clients. It was terrible situations. It was, working for a law firm, especially a big law firm, is a terrible work life balance. It's, like a terrible work environment. It's still very much that bro culture. And I hated it, all of it. So I had an opportunity to quit and I took it, especially because my husband was like, please, please quit. You're miserable. And I thought like a couple months and I would figure something out. Like I would figure out what my next step was. I knew I wanted it to be like somewhat creative. I knew I needed that back in my life because I felt like that was such a big part of my soul that I had really lost a part of my soul in the past couple of years that I had been doing like a lot of that litigation. But yeah, it ended up taking me like 5 years to figure out an idea that, stuck. And as you kind of alluded to, like during that 5 years, I tried a lot of different things. And this time I gave myself permission to not feel like I had to see it through, right? Like I kind of knew entertainment was for me, but I felt like I had to see that through to prove it to myself. I kind of knew like what I was doing in lawyering wasn't 100% what I wanted to do, but I felt like I really had to see that through. So this time I wrote half of a romance novel and was like, this is not my jam. Like, I can't do this. So I have a half written romance novel. Like I did a business plan for a children's clothing store. And even after like going and seeing spaces to like commit to, a commercial rental, I said, you know what, this isn't it either. Like there's so many things that I'm doubting about myself and doubting about this, that this isn't the right step. I think that that's like that was a big turning point for me, was being able to say, you can quit. Like you can stop. You can not follow through. and and that's okay.
That's an interesting lesson. I mean, I think, first of all, the idea of being stuck, right? I think that lots of people get into a job, right? So as an example, in like the career development space, you'll meet someone who's like, I just took this new job. I've been there 2 months and I already know that this is not the right place. But they feel like because they just took the job, that they can't leave the job. Or someone will say, oh, well, I haven't been there a year yet and I don't want to have a job on my resume that was less than a year. And so they're like, I'm sort of stuck. I have to stay. And I mean, I don't necessarily believe that anyone has to stay anywhere. I urge people all of the time to consider like, hey, if this isn't the right fit, don't stay. Well, at the same time, knowing that I stayed too long in jobs before, right? One of my early corporate jobs, I knew a year before I left that I should have left. And I had even told my boss that I thought I was getting to a point where I should be considering some other options. And yet I stayed, right? Or things get really bad
things get out of alignment. You don't feel like it's the same place that you started, and yet you stick it out because you think, well, maybe things will get better, right? And so like all I'm saying is that there's sort of a universal like theme to the idea of people getting places and feeling like they need to see it through because they feel like, well, I made this commitment. And I think it's really important to stress here that, you know, we all have the ability to change course, to change direction, to change our mind. You know, most risks are two directional. Most choices are two directional. Most things can be undone, pivoted from, redirected, like made something new, you know? And so I think what I like about your story, Liz, is that after you realized that you didn't have to stick it out, you gave yourself permission to explore, to be creative, to, you know, test some things out, to be curious. And, you know, I guess looking back, how do you feel now after giving yourself permission and making all those choices? How do you feel about your half-written romance novel, for example?
Okay, in all honesty, I don't think about it very often, right?
Right, exactly.
In all honesty, it's
You moved on.
there just because, you know, Google Drive keeps everything these days. But had it been on paper, I probably would have thrown it out at this point because it was part of a process in a lot of ways, right? And I kind of understood that while I was doing it, that I literally was going through a process, and I knew I was going through that process at the time because I felt like I had been so rigid in my thinking or my expectations that I hadn't allowed myself to do an exploration that, you know, maybe other people do younger. I don't know. I hope other people get more of a chance to do this. I honestly don't think most people do. Like, I think most people get real stuck on a path and then, you know, for a variety of reasons. I also recognize my privilege in that I had the time and capacity to try all those things while I wasn't working. So I was able to really test them as, okay, what would it be like to be a full-time writer? And, you know, I was fortunate that I had met someone who actually, she is a published writer. She's published several books and that like was her job. So she helped walk me through like, okay, well, here's how my day works. And here's, you know, all the expectations and here's all the hidden things that you don't know. Like, it isn't just like being creative and sitting down and writing. Like, here's all the aspects of the job that don't involve writing and being creative and thinking of fun stories. And so I think, if anything, like, we all have an idea of what a job or an industry is going to be like before we get into it. Same thing with being an entrepreneur, right? Like, starting a shoe company, I just thought about the shoes. And then, like, as I'm a year into it, I'm like, oh no, there's all these aspects of packaging and dealing with manufacturers overseas and tariffs and, you know, like these things that you don't truly understand actually take up more time than like what you think of as the main aspect of the business, which is also why like being a lawyer was nothing like going to law school. And in fact, when I was teaching, people laugh at me, but like one of my proudest things about teaching, I taught a first year level like writing course, was that I got people to quit. I got people to drop out of law school. And not because they thought they were bad or, you know, like not because I like made them feel bad about themselves, because I made them realize that law school and practicing law are very different skills. And part of why you feel stuck in something is like student loans or money, or do you know, like they call it the golden handcuffs in law school. It's true. Like, if you go through 3 years of law school and then you start working and realize you hate it, you have a lot of debt to pay off most of the time. So I encouraged like all of my students, I said, spend a lot of time with real lawyers doing real legal work. Ask them what their average day is like. Ask them if they liked law school, because I guarantee the happiest of lawyers probably hated law school, and people who loved law school are probably not happy lawyers. And then ask them how much they're making and what they expect to make in 20 years. Like, are you ever going to pay off this debt?
I do want to sort of add though, Liz, that like during all that years of exploration, right? And like figuring things out, you weren't just on this sort of like work journey, you were also transitioning your family, right? And so it wasn't like you weren't doing anything because you were like, oh, well, I didn't do anything. It took me 5 years to figure it out. And it's like, well, there were other transitions happening. And so like one of the things I want to make sure that we sort of give credit to is the fact that like with each additional child, that's a life transition. And like there was some moving that happened. And so that's a transition. And so on top of this self exploration and trying to figure out like, what do I want to do when I grow up? It's also like the circumstances of your life were changing. And, you know, for many of us, I think those transitions happen while we're already in sort of a journey. So let's just say that you stuck with being a lawyer, or, you know, you're someone who's in corporate and you've sort of got the golden handcuffs. Maybe you also have gratitude handcuffs. So I don't know if this resonates with you, Liz, but like coming from a blue collar environment and seeing this also in other people who kind of come from more of those like scarcity backgrounds, when you start making money and you work for a good company and you have great benefits, there's also this sort of like resistance to rock the boat because you're so grateful. And sometimes that prevents you from making the choices that are in your best interest, or asking for like self-advocating for the things that you need, because you're just like, well, I don't want to seem ungrateful because I'm actually very grateful. And so golden handcuffs, right? Like I'm making the money, I've got the titles, like all the bells and whistles of like traditional success. And then you add in the gratitude component and all of a sudden you feel very weighted down to make decisions. And then simultaneously, your life is changing. Maybe you got a new baby. Maybe you got a divorce. Maybe somebody that was really important to you passed away. And so all of these things have an impact, but you were sort of doing in them all at the same time. And so that's a lot of exploration, right? Like, and transition and evolution to kind of have at the same time. So, I mean, like, I just think it's worth kind of calling out that like it wasn't the only thing you had going on, you know? It wasn't like you were just twiddling your thumbs and you're like, well, I wrote a novel and now I'm going to go do this other thing. Like life was happening.
Very much so. Yeah. So yes, I had already had two beautiful little boys and you know, got pregnant shortly after quitting, and pregnancies for me were very difficult. I would have hyperemesis gravidarum like the entire pregnancy, and I had 3 NICU babies, so they were difficult. I think I kind of got through them with this stoicism, and then afterwards, like after having my third, realized like how much almost like PTSD I had from my pregnancies. So there was 100% like I also had postpartum depression with her. So yes, there was a lot personally I was like dealing with while trying to kind of explore who I was. And then, gosh, when my third was 2.5, the pandemic started. So part of this process was also me figuring out the weekend before the pandemic started, I had finished a course in getting my certification as a mediator. And then that went nowhere because the pandemic started, and San Francisco in the pandemic, like we were shut down for almost 18 months in terms of like my kids didn't go back to school for 18 months. So yes, I was full-time parent to 3 children. My husband works a lot and has like an awesome job, which enables me to do the exploration, but also gives me some more responsibilities because my role is more of the like caretaker, homemaker, mom. So like maybe that's a little bit of my gratitude part in this exploration. There were times when I felt guilty doing some of that exploration because it was taking time away from household needs, from time with my kids, from helping my husband out, like things like that. And he was doing really well. He was at his dream job. He was making good money. And there's a part that feels guilty for doing anything that felt like it could take away from him being able to do that. So yes, some of my exploration was a little bit slower. And I also, I had to learn a lot about myself in some ways. Like one of the things I did during that time is I was a CASA, which is a court appointed special advocate, because I've always had like this very strict sense of kind of like moral justice in a way. And for some reason, like foster kids just are, ever since I was a little kid and like learned about the fostering system, I just kind of felt like they got the worst end of the deal in our society in so many ways, and always wanted to be involved in the system somehow. So I became a court appointed special advocate, which means I was like helping out a foster kid. And after a long time of doing that, I realized that like I am too empathetic and too much of a problem solver, that I got so involved and felt so frustrated that I could not fix this girl's problems and make her life perfect, that, that was really hard on my mental health as well. Combined with the fact that I'm like, I did have, my third at that time. So I was like going through PPD and like whatever. So it didn't help. It was like compounding a lot of issues for me. So I learned that like, no, I probably shouldn't, one of my things was like, should I use my lawyer's legal skills to like become a lawyer for foster kids, right? Or something along those lines. And I was like, no, I would like drown in the feeling of like helplessness, and I cannot disconnect. Like I have a friend who's a public defender and I talk to her a lot about it, and she's like, no, I get home from work and I'm home. Like she disconnects from what happens at work and what happens at home, and it doesn't weigh on her. It doesn't, like she has a different personality, and I like couldn't stop thinking about it to the point that like it was affecting my kids and my family and like myself. So I knew that whatever I ended up like choosing or doing eventually, I wanted to have some sort of like social good component to it. But I recognized that it probably wasn't going to be like in the trenches somewhere. And I felt really guilty about that too. Like I felt guilty about the fact that my personality just isn't such that I can't do that because I wanted to. But I kind of had to like come to terms with like there's a lot of different people in this world and different ways that we can like contribute and help. And if mine is a more indirect way or lighthearted way, then that's how I need to do that, or else I'm not helpful to anybody.
Now, Liz, you're doing all these new things. You keep trying things. You're able to figure out that like whatever that thing is isn't it, which I actually think is like a really interesting concept on its own, right? Because I don't know, like when you were talking about the empathy you felt, I could see how it would be just as easy in that environment to stop and think, well, this must be my calling, right? Like I could see in that moment, it would have been just as easy for someone to say, oh, well, I feel such a connection to that this is my calling. But instead you looked at the situation and you were like, this is not my cross to bear. Like, this is not going to be a good situation for me if I like sort of continue on this path. And so I think there's something really interesting there. But what I want to know from you is during all of those years of exploration, right? So you're writing books, you're creating business plans, you're volunteering. What surprised you the most about yourself?
Yeah, so I learned a lot about myself, I think. So when I initially quit being a lawyer, I just had felt really overwhelmed. And part of that is we lived in a big city. My husband worked a lot. I had 2 kids at the time, trying for 3, and so I thought, well, my solution is, and I also I'm one of those people who's like, if they asked me to be on the PTA, I was like, well, of course, if you need someone to be on the PTA, of course I'll be on the PTA because you need me. And so I kind of gave myself the permission to say no. And I was like, okay, I'm going to say no. I'm going to like literally go down to nothing and see where that takes me. And I learned that I'm really bad with unstructured time and energy. Like I'm really not good at it. I'm not good at structuring myself. It's almost like I was so productive when I was really busy. And then when I wasn't busy, I couldn't get anything done, like even simple things. And I thought that my being overwhelmed was because I had so much going on and so much to do. But really, it was that I had terrible processes and systems in my life. And so part of my growth during that 5 years was also figuring out some processes and systems so that I could kind of like, be there for myself, honestly, but also be there for my family and accomplish things in life while not feeling overwhelmed constantly. And, helping me figure out like how I could find something that was structured enough that it didn't leave me feeling overwhelmed, but unstructured enough that I felt like I had some creativity in it. I had to learn these processes. And I think maybe the surprising part of that for me was like, I had always assumed that those things were just natural to people and not like a skill you had to learn. So now I'm recognizing like those are skills. I need them. I have to teach my children them. They just don't like naturally understand them either. So that's like a big part of my growth over the last couple of years. The other one was like, I kind of knew this, but I'm kind of an extreme person, like, and kind of black and white in a lot of ways, right? Like things are right or wrong, things are this or that. And, I was either creative or I was like analytical. And I needed to figure out, like, no, those are both a part of me. I'm not an either or, right? Like I am both. And I can't, focus on one to the exclusion of the other and be satisfied with my life. I'm terrible at asking for help. Terrible at asking for help. Like, and part of that, I was raised like a little bit feral in a way, right? Like I was raised to like never ask for help and I'm really bad at it. And part of it is I also have like a really big fear of rejection. Like, if you ask for help enough times and someone says no, you just don't ask again. And so I realized that if I was an adult in the community and wanting stuff out of my life, I had to learn how to be better about asking for help and reaching out.
Has that happened,
Um,
Liz? Have you asked for help and not gotten it?
oh, so many times. Yeah.
Interesting. I only ask because I feel like I don't think I know anyone who's good about asking for help, but I feel like typically when I've ventured to ask for help, people are typically willing to step in and offer some assistance. So I'm disappointed and surprised to hear that you asked for help and like were turned away. I mean, that's yeah, that's both disappointing and surprising to me. But again, based on my own experiences. And maybe I just
Yeah.
don't ask for help enough. Maybe I just haven't asked enough to get rejected. Like I don't know.
So I'm without going into complicated things, it was a trait I learned young. And so it carried into my adult life. Now, after learning how bad I am at it, and learning to ask for more help. I have found in the past couple of years that as an adult, yes, people are very willing to help and talk to you. And so it's something that like it was harder for me when I was younger because like I said, I think I was like raised to be very self-sufficient and I was very self-sufficient. And I was raised to like never show emotion and I didn't show emotion. So like these are things that I've had to like learn how to be vulnerable, learn how to, ask for things, learn how to rely on other people sometimes. And that is something that was kind of like I had learned early in life not to do that.
Sure. So I want to pivot just a little bit here, Liz, and I want to talk about your shoes because again, we've gone now through this like 5-year journey exploration. We've had a couple kids, like, life has changed a lot. And then you settle on shoes. And I want to talk about the meaning of shoes. I want to get to know what inspired you to focus on footwear. And then I want to understand how Nix and Ness became that creative outlet that you'd been seeking. And so I know that's kind of a very long-winded, compounded question, but I think that the gist I'm trying to understand is like, how did it come to shoes? And then like, there's a meaning in the shoes, right? Because you've got the quotes and everything. And so I'm just kind of wanting to understand like, how did it all come together? And then ultimately, like, what does that mean for you now going forward?
In some ways, I can't tell you exactly how it came together because it kind of just did in the right way. Like it was kind of natural, but in other ways, like looking back on it, I recognize it as finally something that kind of combined the either or, So shoes and footwear is of an interesting industry. It's fashion, and I love fashion. I love fun things. It's also extremely functional, right? It's one of your few fashion items that has to also be, that has like a very distinct purpose. And I kind of like that tension a little bit because it feels like my tension right inside me. It's fun. It can be playful. You can use fun colors. You can do all these fun things with it. But at the end of the day, if it's not functional and it doesn't work and you're uncomfortable or things fall off or they don't keep your feet dry or whatever it is, at the end of the day, if it doesn't function the way it's supposed to, then it's not a very good product, is it? So I like that. I like taking things that should be functional and make them not just functional, like bring fun and energy and beauty and color to them. And I guess I got there because I was like sitting in my closet one day and I just gotten this shipment of shoes from this brand from the UK that I like absolutely adore. And, I had been noodling over like so many different ideas as I am. I'm one of those people who's like, every day I'm like, oh, that'd be an interesting business idea. Oh, that'd be, like I'm constantly thinking about it. So my first thought was like, I wonder what it would be like. Maybe I could see if I could like become the distributor, maybe I could figure out a way to get them to the US. And then just kind of as an afterthought, it was like, well, I wonder how you even make shoes, because that's also me. Like I'm always like taking things apart or trying to figure out how they're made or how they run or whatever. And so I kind of started percolating that in the back of my head. And then I had this idea like, oh my gosh, how fun. We have motivational jewelry and motivational t-shirts and motivational underwear and motivational notebooks. Like, why can't we have something fun in shoes that's also motivational? Because they're so important to you. Like, they ground you. They're literally touching the ground. Your shoes can make or break your day because they're uncomfortable shoes. Like, your confidence is ruined. You walk into court in an uncomfortable pair of heels, you're not gonna win that court case as easily as if you walk in and you have your power shoes on and you feel amazing. So I kind of, wanted to explore that. And I thought about, my first idea was like, oh my gosh, I can make these Ruth Bader Ginsburg boots where you have a collar and you could like exchange the collar. And so, it kind of made the shoe like fun and somewhat customizable, and it had meaning to it because I had this really great quote from her. And so I just kind of went with that and started building a business plan and started talking to a couple people in the industry. I went to Brooklyn and I took this week-long like shoemaking course where I actually prototyped the Ruth Bader Ginsburg heels, and it just felt right. And I guess that's the ultimate why did I do this? Because it felt right. Like it felt like the best metaphor for me in a way. Like it was all of these creative, analytical, socially conscious, kind of all these things coming together that no one else had done before and was like something truly different than anything else in the market. And it just felt right. And at no point during the process was I like, yeah, do you want to abandon this right now? Like, do you want to like cut this off? And it just, there was never really a point where that had happened. So I just kept going with it. And now I'm here.
I think what stands out the most to me for your story about the shoes is like, I'm kind of like you in the sense, Liz, where every day I like see something, I'm like, ooh, how does that business work? Or like, could that be a business? And so like, I'm always having those thoughts. So I'm there with you. Okay. But I also have to say, like, sometimes I get these like wild ideas. And one of my wild ideas would require me to try to figure out like, how are certain things made? Where do you source materials? Like, what does the process look like? How do you make sure it's profitable, right? Because there's so many like fixed costs in the production of a like a physical object. And so I have to ask, like, I mean, yeah, you were a lawyer, and I'm sure that gave you some exposure to some of like where you might find the information you were looking for. But I mean, to go from 5 years of exploration, being a mom, and then just one day you're like, I design and manufacture shoes. Like, that's a really big undertaking. And I'm just curious, like, what did that process of exploration look like for you to figure out, like, was this feasible? I mean, I think the class sounds like a wonderful place to start, right? We're prototyping shoes. We understand how they get, put together. But I mean, like, there's still a lot of things to figure out. I mean, I knew a lady who was inventing some kind of new bra material, and she was like flying to like all different countries around the world to test like fabrics and manufacturing of her invention and like all these things. And so I can't imagine, like, where do you even start?
So this is okay. So this is funny because it ties back in a little bit here. So I learned how to ask for help, right?
Oh.
And I learned how to look for help. So, and I think this is also a lesson that I really learned. So my husband went to business school, and one of the biggest things I think I learned while he was in business school, because I ended up going to a lot of events and stuff with him, is that like life really is about like personal relationships. And I think that's even though we have the internet these days and there's like wider reach, you feel like you could reach anyone. In some ways, that's almost made it even more important to have those personal relationships. You could get 8,000 resumes for a job opening, but if someone says, yeah, my friend wants this job, yeah, it's like, yeah, I don't know someone on a piece of paper from like average Joe, but that personal relationship is like super important, more important these days than ever in some ways. So I not only did the class in Brooklyn, but I found this woman who kind of runs a like shoe startup community. And so she has like a course that I took, and it was actually like really well run, really well organized. And then I still to this day, three years later, it's been 3 years. Every month we meet up as like shoe startups and kind of talk through things. And so she was the one who introduced me to someone who introduced me to my manufacturer. So like all of it was at every meeting, I ask for help, and I get that help because we're all in there together to help each other. And it's made the process like infinitely easier, but also like more manageable. And for a long time, like, so I had my idea, and it wasn't until a full 2 years later that I like had shoes I could sell. So probably for the first full year, I very much took it as like, what's the next step? That's it. What is the next step? And I will work on that and figure that out, and then go to the step after that. Like it was I wasn't going to worry about all the things that come with like trying to build a brand until a certain point. So once I kind of like knew I had the shoes where I wanted them, knew I had the manufacturer that I wanted, because I actually flew to China and visited her and met her in person and saw the factory and like felt very confident in that. Then it was like, okay, now I open the floodgates. And like, okay, now I got to figure out how to like actually run a company and do all the things. And there's so much more to it, right? But in that exploration, I guess because I had explored stuff before and realized that like you can't open the floodgates until you're like, you feel like your product or your idea is pretty good. And because it allowed me to like be able to at any moment be like, yeah, this isn't for me, I'm done with this. Until I got to a point where I felt like, yes, this is for me. Yes, I'm gonna keep doing this. Like I'm all in at this point. I just kind of focused one step at a time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I will say, anyone who's ever explored entrepreneurship, and maybe not in manufacturing, but just like generally speaking, explored entrepreneurship, there's a lot of advice out there that you just like, you get started, right? And you just kind of jump in head first. And so what I kind of like about your take on it, Liz, is that you're sort of like, you didn't necessarily jump in head first. You sort of just took it one step at a time. And I couldn't help the business school part of me was like sunk cost, sunk cost. Like I kept thinking about the sunk cost, and I was like, here you are progressing and and like it's sort of like, okay, you're investing, and you don't really know where it's going because you haven't fully jumped in headfirst to the sort of business side of it. And so I just think that's interesting. I don't really necessarily like have anything specific to say about it other than I just observed that it was a little bit different than the business advice that you might see if you went on like a Google search and watched like a YouTube video, or, some of these like business gurus that make like, influencer content. It's a little different. I think it's worth noticing.
One, I totally know what you're saying. I, for a long time, was addicted to like How I Built This by Guy Raz. Oh my gosh, like best podcast ever. And they have so many different people on like how they built their business, basically. And I do remember after a lot of episodes thinking the one constant theme is people are kind of like, I just went for it, right? Like everyone told me it couldn't work, or I knew nothing about it. I just had this idea and I just went for it. And in some ways, it was a benefit in a lot of ways because I didn't know anything about the industry. So I wasn't stuck in certain expectations or certain ruts or like, well, this is the way it's supposed to go. And I said that with air quotes, right? So, and it was like a new idea and I came at things from a different perspective. So like that was a huge thing that I was always thinking about, that like, do I have experience in the shoe industry? No, but there were many, many other people who have built businesses without direct experience because they had an idea and they just went for it. And a lot of times people who are in the industry can see all the things wrong with it before they even start and don't do it and, talk themselves out of it before they even start. I have done not a lot in this business that like people would say like, this is how you're supposed to start your business, right? Like I know that people these days are like really big on doing MVPs, and which is minimal viable products, and testing your markets and whatever. And like most shoe startups will start with one style with like 3 or 4 colors, and they start with that. And for a lot of reasons, that is the really smart business like decision. I just knew that that wouldn't work for like what I was trying to show and build in my business. And even now I still feel like because one of the things I want is like an inclusivity and diversity in the women represented in the shoes, and like what's going, what people want to kind of feel throughout their day. And so I still have like 1,000 more ideas of like how I can do that. So in a lot of ways, like nothing I've done has been how you are quote unquote supposed to start a business. But I just kind of went with staying true to like my brand and my idea for the brand, as opposed to doing something that conventional wisdom maybe says I should or shouldn't do. So that's number 2. Number 3, in terms of sunk cost, I totally get that. I like to think, and maybe it's because I have explored so many things and in part feel like all of those things taught me something, that sure, maybe there's a time cost. A lot of times there's a cost, a money cost, right? There's an emotional cost, but it's a journey, right? Like I don't think of a lot of things in the journey of my life in terms of a cost. There are lessons that have gotten me to where I am now, which is a much better, fulfilling whole place than I was before. And if I hadn't done things because of the time cost or whatever, or if I hadn't quit things, even though I had put that time and energy into it, then I feel like I would still be stuck in a place that like was pretty unhappy. So overall, like whether it's a selfish way of thinking or not, but it's my life. So anything I do in it, the price I pay for it ultimately it's about, is my life like better for that price that I paid? Yeah. Yeah. For the most part, like the cost of things has been the price of like where I am in my life. And that's kind of how I look at it.
Yeah, I funny enough believe a lot of things that contradict each other, but one of the things I also believe is that, nothing is ever really wasted. And anecdotally this week actually, I was supposed to go to a photo shoot. I had prepaid for 4 photo shoots for this year for content for my business. And I had a photo shoot scheduled, and I even had my bag packed to go to the photo shoot and have like a change of outfits. But I was having one of those days where I was just like, I feel overwhelmed. I've got too much on my plate, and I'm really not into the idea of going to this photo shoot. And so, I mean, I'd already spent the money, and I decided not to go. I just canceled the photo shoot and I didn't go. And now I'm out of my money. But you know what? I gained back some time. And so while, hindsight's 2020, maybe I shouldn't have bought the photo shoots in advance that way. I also look at it and say, my time that I kind of gained back and taking some of that pressure off myself was worth the money that I just sort of flushed down the toilet because I didn't go to the photo shoot. So while I talk about sunk costs, I like also sort of get it and realize that like nothing's ever really wasted. Like I just sort of perceptually just said, you know what? The money I spent for the photo shoot just bought me back some time that I blocked out on my calendar today. And now today's less stressful than it would have been if I had gone to the photo shoot. So for me, I just needed like a redirection on how the money was used, more frugal plans for next year, maybe. I don't know. But I totally get it, Liz.
Yeah, I think maybe something else in my learning the past couple years is that energy can be exponential in the sense that when I'm at that low point and my energy is low, but this year for me, that situation was the Casey Musgraves concert. Like I had paid for it a long time ago. I was excited about it. But the day of, I was having a really difficult day. And the thought of like, I get overwhelmed in crowds. I have like, like loud noises sometimes. Like sometimes I don't mind it, but sometimes like it's like everything's like pressing in on me. And I just knew that if I went, I probably would enjoy a lot of it. I would enjoy seeing her. Obviously, I wanted to see her, but like my crash afterwards would be longer than the event. And so I would force myself to kind of push myself to get the energy for this event that I knew I was going to struggle with. And then I would probably crash for like a whole day or two because I had used that energy. And whereas if I just gave myself that evening back in terms of like energy usage, then I would be probably fine the next day if I had done enough the night before in like self-care to like resume certain normal like life things. And so, yes, was it money, quote unquote, wasted because I didn't end up going? Sure. But like when we start monetizing everything in our lives, like I have a really hard time with that concept, I guess. Like money is great. Money can be stressful, money can be helpful, money can be so many things, but ultimately like it's not the end all be all, right? Like your energy, your emotional well-being, your connections with like your close friends and family, like those are all going to be more important than any dollar you spend.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we were talking earlier, where certain times when we feel stuck, it's really, I mean, in a way, it's about monetization, like maybe not always directly, but that whatever that indirect thing still ties often to some sort of financial resource. And I don't want to be dismissive about the fact that, like, look, I'm in a privileged position. I know there are people where like every single cent counts. I've lived that life, I know what that's like. So I don't want to be dismissive, but I will say that sometimes we get into these mindsets where we feel stuck because of things that do somehow tie monetarily to something else. And I think there's a real self-advocacy in saying, despite the fact that I've spent this money, I'm going to make the choice that doesn't make me feel stuck. Like, I'm not stuck. I can make a different choice, even for something fun, like going to a concert. Now, Liz, we are coming near the end of our show, though, and I actually feel like this whole energy conversation could be a whole nother podcast episode.
Right. I mean, so one last point on that, to that end, like when I was in LA and I was, early on in my career and doing all those things, one of my biggest stresses was money, right? Like the entertainment industry thrives off of like free and underpaid labor, right? And there's not a lot of like respect there for people coming in at an entry level. So, and I wasn't good with, there are people out there who are like, if I don't pay my rent on time, if, it'll happen. Like they kind of always had this like belief of it'll happen, it'll whatever. And to me, that stressed me out like none other. Like, the idea that I didn't know if I was going to afford my rent. I didn't know if I could, should I buy the fresh apples or just go with the hot dogs? Because at least those will last a little bit longer, and they're cheaper and whatever. Like that stressed me out to like no end. And so there was a part of me that was very much like, I know if I become a lawyer, I have that good salary. I have those good benefits. I am appreciated for like my brain and somewhat respected. And that was a motivating factor in me choosing a totally different profession, as opposed to, say, making a slight change. That's also my extreme personality. It was like the people who like play the lotto every week and think they're going to like solve their problems by like suddenly becoming a millionaire, as opposed to, I think a little bit of my like learnings is like the better things in life are like a slow progress as opposed to like a huge drastic change right immediately. I didn't fix things by drastically changing my life and going to law school. I have made life better for myself in the past 8 years by slowly working myself towards a solution, a job, like something that interests me, as opposed to like trying to jump off the deep end into the pool, right? Like I'm not going to win the lottery and tomorrow be able to like do everything I want to. So how do I create the building blocks? How do I explore the building blocks? How do I do that in a way that's like a slower progress? And I think that's hard for our society right now. You expect everything to be like instantaneous. And I think that's part of why people feel stuck, because they don't see an instant way out of where they are. And I think we just have to realize that like there probably isn't an instant way out of where we're stuck. There's a slow progression out, especially when you need to make sure your like basic needs are met. But there is a way out. It's just slow.
Well, I mean, at the crux, that's what life is. It's about the process, not the destination. So yeah. I think, it's easy to lose sight of that and to focus always on like this place in the future. Guilty as charged. But I will say it's so much easier to focus on the destination and not think about the journey. But life is in the journey. Life is in the process. And, all of the things, all the choices that we make each day contribute to, that process, that journey. And so I'm right there with you, Liz. I get it. We're speaking the same language.
Definitely.
I will say though, if someone was like, you know what, this whole episode was way too long, I did not listen. What is like one thing you'd want a listener to take away from our conversation?
Life is not an either or, like life is a beautiful bouquet of a wide variety of things. And most people are not an either or. We try to think of life that way because it makes it easy, but you're not going to be happy unless you say yes and, right? Like the classic improv. Like you're not going to be happy unless you really accept all the parts of who you are. Even if someone told you to be ashamed of that part prior, who cares? Like, it's part of who you are, and you are not wrong. You are a person. Accept all of that as just part of who you are, and then figure out how you find something that makes you happy with all those parts, not just the ones you think are the best parts or the ones that you think are the most important parts. Like, all of them matter.
I think that's great advice, Liz. Thank you so much for being on the show and
Thank
sharing your
you.
journey with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I loved talking to you, so this was fun.
If you enjoyed this episode and are seeking to redefine success on your own terms, subscribe to Small Acts of Rebellion and join a community that celebrates authenticity and personal growth.